girls with their nails done now. Girls with their nails done.
Dark greetings, welcome to HALLOWEEK. Today we're talking about the psychology of the horror genre, why we like it, why we're drawn to it, what the research has to say. The reason for this is that the older I get, the more I realize I'm kind of a horror gal, or if not horror, at least gothic genre gal. I was talking to my parents about this a while ago and telling them that, the more of a writer I become, the more I'm getting comfortable with the reality that I don't make exactly cozy, fluffy books. And my mom was like, hey, don't you think that your love for horror is what's making you anxious, or just sort of like veiling your brain in darkness, kind of? And when she asked me that, I felt like I had so much to explain about why it's not the case that I figured I would look into the research and talk about it here. So we're going to explore exactly the kind of person that likes horror, the kind of person that horror is not for, and why that is. By the way, if you also love all things scary, do check out my novel, The Curse in Their Veins. It's a psychological thriller with supernatural elements. And don't get me wrong, it's not like a super scary, terrifying book. It's not like that. It's more psychological than anything. But yeah, I'll leave a link down below if you want to read the synopsis if you're interested in it. What is horror? There are 5 elements to horror: suspense, fear, violence, gore, and the supernatural. Now, suspense is simple. It's wanting to know what's going to happen, staying on the hook, and sort of incrementally increasing that tension in a way that makes you feel physiologically aroused, in a way that's kind of akin to like going into a haunted house, not knowing what's going to pop out around the corner. It's exciting, it's thrilling, it's stimulating. People like that. Fear, this one is also self-explanatory. It's sort of the fight or flight response, but without a sense that we're unsafe. Because a lot of the times when we are in fight or flight, we feel like something terrible is going to happen to us, like we have to protect ourselves, like there's an instant threat or danger. And that's not the case with horror, because in most cases we have this cognitive belief that I'm safe even though something scary is happening, even though my body is saying that something scary is happening. Violence is an interesting element in horror because it shows this unconscious potential for aggression that we all have. It speaks to the ugliest, scariest aspects of humans that we all have to some degree. Of course, some people are far more aggressive and violent than others, but at the end of the day, the most dangerous people are the ones who do not acknowledge their own aggression. So horror gives us a chance to really look that in the face, to say there is violence that happens out there and there is violence within us, to really look it in the face. Gore is kind of along the same lines as violence, and also it's a little bit more exciting too because it has this like shock value. People can get addicted to gory content. And so in a sense, gore is my least favorite element of horror. From a Freudian perspective, gore is about what he calls the uncanny, showing us what could happen if we stopped trying to repress the instincts of the id. If you're familiar with the 3-part construction of the mind that Freud came up with, there's the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the part of us that's very instinct-driven, very animalistic, doesn't really have a moral compass. And the supernatural is the 5th element. This is these invisible forces that influence us. It's the unknown, it's the mystical. We're interested in what cannot be seen, whether it's a virus, a ghost, a god, mental illness. We're fascinated with things that affect us that cannot be seen by the naked eye. So who tends to watch horror? Research shows that people who are higher in anxiousness tend to watch horror, people higher in sensation seeking, people who are higher in openness to experiences, people who enjoy intellectual stimulation and imaginative activities, younger people, men. Although men and women tend to prefer different things about horror, like women tend to prefer if it has a happy ending, if the protagonist won and sort of beat the bad guy, men tend to prefer more shocking, terrifying things happening throughout the movie, which is interesting. And now this last one, there's a little bit of debate about. Some researchers have theorized, quite interestingly, that horror watchers or readers are lower in empathy because they hypothesize that people who watch horror don't feel as distressed for the protagonist when they're watching horror. And when I first heard this, I was like, okay, this sounds a little biased because I know for me, I love horror. I still feel distressed for the protagonist. In a lot of ways, I feel like it makes it more rewarding when the good guy does win. You know, like in a lot of ways, I see parallels as a therapist working with intimate partner violence, where it's very frustrating. You really feel for the victim when they're going through it. But when they are finally able to break free of that cycle, it is all the more rewarding. It's not that you don't feel for them, you know, it's not that you have low empathy for the victim, not at all. So there's mixed research on this. Some research shows that there is a correlation between low empathy and a preference for horror. Some research shows that there's not. Personally, I suspect it may have more to do with having a specific personality style that enjoys sensation seeking. You know, we know that psychopathy, for instance, is associated with both low empathy and sensation seeking. So if you are someone with that personality style that really enjoys horror, it makes sense you're going to skew the research to be lower in empathy. I also suspect it may have to do with the fact that men tend to prefer horror and men overall tend to be lower in empathy than women. So let's go into why some people might enjoy watching horror more than their counterparts. The first thing you gotta understand is that the horror genre gives people a safe place to practice being afraid, disgusted, and thrilled. We know that people with anxiety tend to struggle with the avoidance of fear. People with OCD tend to struggle with either the avoidance of fear and/or the avoidance of disgust. People with trauma sometimes struggle with feeling thrilled or afraid. And like I talk about ad nauseum, the avoidance of an emotion only augments how distressing it becomes. So horror kind of gives people a safe setting where they can practice feeling these emotions. So think about it. You might have a panic attack if you think about something upsetting happening out there in the real world. But when you're watching a scary movie, you can acknowledge that it's okay to feel your heart racing. It's not the end of the world. You're safe. You're just having a physiological reaction that will pass. Imagine how many anxiety disorders would dissipate if this is the attitude we took towards fear at all times. If when we started to notice a panic symptom, for instance, we were to say, it's okay, I'm safe here. It's fine that I'm feeling this way. It's fine that my body is producing this reaction. I'm actually not going to die. So horror gives us a context in which to practice emotion regulation. I also think one of the things that's kind of cozy about horror is that there's this contrast between what's happening on screen, which is scary, unsafe, versus the safe setting that you're in. It's kind of like when you're inside with like a cup of coffee, a fire going, a candle lit, music playing, and outside it's super gloomy, maybe it's snowy or rainy or whatever it is. The contrast between the two breeds gratitude because you're recognizing I'm in such a good position right now, and that is so different from what's happening out there or what's happening on screen. Now, the key here, the key to being able to enjoy horror is that you have to actually feel safe. You have to have the cognitive piece of I'm in a place where something bad isn't going to happen to me. If you feel actually unsafe, then horror might not be for you. You know, like if you watch a super scary ghost story and you genuinely believe that your house is haunted, then yeah, it's possible that you're going to be flooded with fear and that the horror can actually trigger feelings of unsafety afterwards. But for the most part, it can ironically make you less fearful in real life. So let me give you a little story. When I was, I think, like 10 or 11 years old, my parents and I visited Savannah, which is renowned for being full of ghost stories. It's this old southern town that has a lot of history. And I bought this little ghost story book, and I was reading from it on the car ride back. And that night, I was so terrified. I don't know why this image stuck with me from one of the ghost stories of like a person who was sleeping with their hand out like that, and that a ghost came and was like preying on their hand. That was a terrifying image to me for some reason. And I did not sleep all night because I was so scared because I genuinely felt like there could be a ghost here. Like, I don't know if there's a ghost or not, and I don't want to sleep with my hand out because a ghost might come and put their hands on it. So I stayed up all night. And by the time the sun rose, I realized that no one had come for me. There was no ghost, and it kind of paradoxically made me realize if no one came for me last night, it's probably because there's not a ghost here. Maybe ghosts aren't even real. So even if horror does scare you and makes you feel really scared in the moment in your genuine safe setting, it could still, in the long run, help you be less afraid. And the research supports this. So some studies show that people who tend to experience anxiety at higher rates are drawn to horror, and scientists speculate that this might be because horror gives them a tangible focal point, whether it's ghosts, zombies, murderers, rather than the more elusive fears that most of us ruminate over, things like illness, failure, rejection, etc. I would also wonder if these very theatrical fears in horror are exaggerated symbols of everyday fears. You know, like if we're scared of getting sick, and zombies are just a symbol of that. They're just an exaggerated, hyperbolic symbol of you're gonna catch something if you touch something that's contaminated. So maybe these horror symbols are just inflated allegories for our real life fears, dressed up in a really exaggerated ways so that they're relatable to us, so that they actually evoke the emotion they're supposed to evoke. And some researchers found that horror fans are more psychologically resilient to the real-life horrors of the COVID pandemic. So there is some very, very preliminary research to make us ask whether practicing fear in safe situations might make us more resilient against genuinely unsafe situations. I think also about how resilience is built in small increments that slowly increase. You know, like when you're going to the gym, what makes your muscles grow stronger is when you are increasing the set number, increasing the weight, increasing the amount of time that you spend doing a certain exercise, every day a little bit more. You get a little bit of that with horror. Usually when horror starts out, it's, sunny day, everything seems fine, drone shot of a pretty setting, and then night comes, and in that first night, something kind of scary happens. Next day, morning, sunshine, and again that night it alternates with a slightly longer period of something scary happening, and again until you get to the climax, which usually takes place only at nighttime, only terrifying things, and you're able to tolerate it for longer because you've essentially built up resilience to the fear, right? Like, it would be weird if a horror movie started and was just like horror in the first 30 minutes with no moments of relief interspersed throughout. That would be strange. I don't think a lot of people would watch that. We need that alternation between sunshine and darkness. And that is essentially how resilience is built. We expose ourselves to increasingly long increments of painful emotions. There's also something called post-horror relaxation, which is after the thrill of consuming horror when we feel relief for the protagonist, that the bad guy was killed, etc. This post-horror relaxation increases endorphins and it makes us feel more relaxed. So it's a similar concept to exercise where you experience short-term stress, and then after that's done, you actually have a baseline of higher endorphins, lower stress than before you started. Also, another way that I think horror can empower people who struggle with fear is as someone who is drawn to writing scary stuff. I also love the idea of doing the scaring because I'm so used to being scared of stupid shit that I love, for once, being the one that does the scaring. Kind of swaps out that power imbalance where I'm not the one the fear is being done to, I am the one doing the fear. It puts me in a position of control. It's a safer way to contextualize fear, and it's more empowered than just something happening to you as the subject where you're powerless about it. In a sense, maybe it's kind of like the defense mechanism of identification with the aggressor. Because in identification with the aggressor, what usually happens is someone has been aggressed or abused in some way. And what they do is they convince themselves that they are like the abuser. They convince themselves that actually, that wasn't so bad what happened. Actually, I wanted that. And then they go on to replicate those cycles and they become the abuser. So in a sense, when you're writing horror or you're writing scary stuff, you have been scared by others, usually because you've watched horror yourself, and now you have a chance to be the one doing the scaring. It makes you feel more powerful and less victimized. Something else that horror can do is it can actually increase safety. When we watch horror movies, it's kind of similar in its function to having nightmares. A major theory of nightmares is that they exist to essentially help us practice how we would react to threatening situations. Where would you run if an alien came down on your house right now? Where would you run if a murderer came in through your door? Nightmares and horror alike help us imaginally practice how we would respond to a situation in the hopes that if that situation were to happen or something like it, we would be better equipped to deal with it. We would survive it. And one piece of evidence towards this theory is that women tend to be drawn towards true crime much more than men do. And we know that women tend to be the victims of true crime much more than men do. So maybe listening to true crime is a way for a lot of women to sort of self-educate about how to spot a serial killer, how to avoid one. So maybe watching or reading horror is similarly a way that we exercise self-protection, that we try to practice thinking about how we would respond to dangerous situations. Something else about horror is that it's a way to boost other more pleasant emotions on the physiologically aroused side of the emotion graph. Okay, let me explain what this means. So I've spoken about the emotion graph, which is split up based on physiological arousal, how fight or flight or relaxed you feel, and valence, which is pleasant or painful. So remember what I said about how research suggests that people higher in sensation-seeking and openness to experiences also prefer the horror movie genre. Fear and excitement are on the same side of the emotion graph. To your body, it is the same feeling. It is your mind that distinguishes I'm scared versus I'm excited. What distinguishes a person that finds air turbulence exciting versus a person that finds it terrifying is the way that they think about it. They're still experiencing the same sensations in their body. And studies show that consuming horror on a date can boost feelings of romance because we suspect it's making us misattribute our fear as something that's actually excitement. We're saying, oh, this isn't actually that I'm scared by this horror movie, this is that my date is exciting to me. Actually, the first video of mine that went viral was the one about do this on a first date. And I was talking about how, essentially, if you do exciting, thrilling, sensation-seeking things on a date, it's a good way to trick yourself and your date into thinking that you're more excited about the date itself. Consuming horror also boosts social bonding. Oxytocin is sometimes released in scary situations. Oxytocin is responsible for the tend and befriend stress response. So when we're watching something scary with a loved one, we release a hormone that may actually boost our feelings of love and connectedness. And so evolutionarily, it makes sense because when you're afraid that the neighboring tribe is about to come invade your tribe, you're going to want to protect your loved ones. You're going to mobilize to save your family, right? So you're going to release oxytocin. So of course, there are benefits to watching horror with someone you care about because it may augment that feeling of closeness and excitement. And I also think about that contrast again, that contrast between the scary, solitary protagonist who has no one else around versus you curled up on the couch with a loved one, feeling like you're so grateful because you're not in the protagonist's shoes. But there are 3 things necessary to actually enjoy horror genre. So what are those 3 things? First of all, we need to believe that we're safe. Like I said, if you don't actually feel safe in the setting where you are located, then you're not going to feel safe watching horror. It's not fun if you genuinely think the threat is going to come for you. So who might horror not be for? People with paranoia, psychosis, impaired reality testing, extremely severe anxiety where they're losing touch with the fact that their anxiety is not rational. Number 2, detachment is necessary. We need to be able to emotionally detach from the experience and recognize that it's just fiction, it's just actors, it's not actually real. So again, who might not be able to do this? People with extreme attachment or empathy. Again, possibly those with impaired reality testing. And number 3, we have to have a sense of confidence that we can overcome the threat. For instance, if someone runs after you and you're a really good runner, you're probably going to feel confident that you can outrun the threat because you have a good self-efficacy, good self-confidence about the ability to outrun someone. So people who have very low self-confidence in their ability to handle stress might not be a great fit for horror. And I'm just going to finish with this quote from one of the articles that I looked at. Research suggests that the absence of any of these psychological protective frames in the moment reduces the preference for horror consumption. So you need these 3 things, otherwise you're probably not going to enjoy horror. Do you like horror? Why or why not? I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of this video, what you think of the research, and if you have read my book, I want to hear your thoughts on that as well, so please leave me a review. Take care.